Somewhere in the skies above the South China Sea, a Qantas Boeing 747 is cruising calmly on its way to Melbourne, Australia. But just 55 minutes after the Queen of the Skies left Hong Kong, the calm is violently disturbed by a huge bang. Air rushes through the aircraft and mist forms in the cabin. The oxygen masks drop down and horrified passengers are able to see the ocean below through a hole in the floor. In this video, we're going to take a look at what happened on Qantas Flight 30, how it happened, and if everyone made it out alive. But first, a huge thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you too would like to get early access or ad-free videos, as well as other cool benefits, head over to Patreon or become a channel member here on YouTube with as little as $3. You can find the links in the description. But now let's get into it. Welcome to airspace. On July 25, 2008, Qantas 30 departed Hong Kong, bound for Melbourne, Australia. The flight had originated in London and was now homebound for a stopover in Hong Kong. On the flight deck were 3 pilots that day, a captain, a first officer and a second officer. The latter was just settling in for his rest period, while the other 2 occupied the flight deck. After having reached their initial cruising altitude of 29,000 feet, the pair probably relaxed a bit, as at this point the less demanding portion of the flight began. But the calm was suddenly disturbed by a violent bang. The 747's autopilot immediately disengaged and the 2 pilots were confronted with a warning that the cabin pressure had dropped significantly. The second officer rushed back to the flight deck to see whether the other 2 pilots needed his help. But they had already donned their oxygen masks and initiated an emergency descent. To help the 747 descend quicker, they reduced the thrust of their engines to idle and deployed the speed brakes on top of the wings, which helped to reduce lift. Now, the 747 was quickly descending to an altitude where normal breathing would again be possible. In the meantime, scenes in the cabin were not as calm and orderly. The oxygen masks had dropped down and almost everybody seemed to be able to get a functioning mask, but some passengers had difficulties to activate their oxygen systems and some masks failed to deploy. Some passengers therefore had to share oxygen masks. But more concerning was the fact that the loud bang that had occurred had torn a quite sizable hole in the skin of the aircraft. Part of the cargo compartment and even the ocean below were visible through a hole in the cabin floor near door 2 right, which is the one right here. The entire door area was a huge mess and looked as if something had exploded there. Finally, the pilots were able to level off the aircraft at an altitude of 10,000 feet, where everybody was able to remove their oxygen masks. At that altitude, no supplementary oxygen is required anymore and people can breathe unassisted. But now, the crew faced a challenging problem. They now had to land the 747 with a 2 by 1.5 meter sized hole in it. That's 6.5 by 5 feet for anyone watching in the States. Additionally, all the instrument landing system receivers had failed, along with other navigational components. Luckily, the weather at Manila, their closest airport, was quite good. After having declared Mayday, the crew then requested radar vectors to the airfield and prepared for a visual approach without landing instrument guidance. Soon, they noticed that another vital component had failed, namely the anti-skid system of the landing gear. This function assures that the wheels of the aircraft do not lock up during braking. Since it was defective now, braking would have to be done in a much more careful manner as to not blow the tires, and the distance required to stop the massive airliner was greater. Luckily, Manila offers quite a long runway. To help alleviate the stress on the brakes and the landing gear, the crew also decided to dump some fuel before landing, which made the aircraft lighter. Finally, the captain made a smooth and surprisingly uneventful landing in Manila. The pilots easily managed to stop the 747 on the runway. Despite a huge hole in the side of the aircraft, it was determined that it was safe to tow the airliner to a gate position where the passengers would be able to disembark after their ordeal. Luckily, and most astonishingly, not one passenger was injured. Despite the large hole, it seemed that all cargo pilots and passengers were accounted for after landing. But what had happened here? Was it a bomb? Certain areas of the plane certainly looked that way. However, when investigators took a closer look, they found no trace of explosives. Instead, when they counted the oxygen bottles that feed the oxygen system, they only found 12, not 13 of them. You see, this Qantas 747-400 had quite a special passenger oxygen system. Most airlines today are equipped with chemical oxygen generators. These use, as the name states, a chemical reaction to produce oxygen for typically 12 to 22 minutes. The 747 on that day, however, had a very traditional oxygen system, one that stored oxygen in 13 big cylinders, not unlike those that are used for scuba diving. One of these cylinders, cylinder number 4, was missing. Next to it, a huge hole in the fuselage was present, and more curiously, there were several oxygen bottle-shaped holes exactly on top of each other, all located directly above the location where the cylinder used to be. To the investigators, the reason for the decompression now became obvious. Cylinder number 4 must have exploded violently. As it did so, it had released large quantities of oxygen, which blew both cabin overpressure valves all the way open. These are installed so that the cabin does not rupture in case of an overpressure. However, as the blast from the cylinder rupture was so localized, it still managed to tear a hole in the 747 just forward of the right wing. The investigators explained the exact accident sequence as follows. The oxygen bottle ruptured 55 minutes after departure. Most likely, it failed at or close to the base, which released the contents of the bottle downwards. The blast tore a hole in the fuselage. As the bottle then violently released its contents through the bottom, it was propelled upwards, much like a rocket. It punched through the cabin floor, hit the door handle of door 2 right, turning the handle almost to the open position. However, since it is not possible to open aircraft doors in flight, the internal mechanism broke, now leaving the handle embedded in the door padding. The cylinder then bounced off a wall and made its way further upwards into the cabin ceiling, where it punched a perfect cylinder-shaped hole in the furnishings. It then bounced back down, fell through the hole it created and departed the aircraft. No part of the cylinder was found on the 747, except for a small valve. The sequence of events is truly astonishing. I wonder what the probability for such a failure is. The oxygen bottle could just as easily have punched through the thin aluminum roof of the 747 or have remained in the cabin. But no, it disappeared without a trace after violently damaging the plane it was supposed to protect. Investigators obviously wanted to find out why the cylinder had failed and therefore took a detailed look at the inspection and maintenance procedures at Qantas. They found that the cylinder that had been installed in the aircraft was not even the oldest one among the other 12. One of them had even been manufactured in the late 80s, but showed no sign of abnormal usage or damage. All the other oxygen bottles looked fine as well. None of them featured any hairline cracks or other suspicious defects. The team then took a closer look at many of these bottles to determine whether there was a hidden danger present in all 747s that featured this kind of oxygen system. However, they were unable to find any flaws in the production process or in the maintenance procedures involved. Since the accident had occurred over water, the failed oxygen bottle could not be located, which further complicated the search for the root cause of the failure. In the end, only one possibility remained. Maybe the bottle was damaged due to a very recent maintenance action? When the investigators looked at the technical logs of the aircraft, they found that 2 entries concerning the oxygen system were made during the past month. At one point, the system pressure had seemed to be low, and the other time, the flight crew had observed pressure fluctuations in the system. On the ground, the problem could unfortunately not be reproduced, and so the correction of the problem was delayed to a later date. All this was not enough evidence for the investigators to be clearly able to determine the true cause of the failure of cylinder number 4. Since this event was the first and to date the only one of its kind, it was determined to be a case of very bad luck. Whether there was a manufacturing defect, maintenance error, sabotage or external influence that led to the rupture of the cylinder could not be determined. All in all, the investigation also determined that the crew was quite lucky that the rupture had not caused more damage than it did. The exploding oxygen bottle had torn through 85 wires, including the first officer's aileron control cables and various other equipment. However, this only partially impaired the function of the oxygen system and disabled some non-critical equipment like the instrument landing system. The accident aircraft structure was successfully repaired and then ferried to Avalon, Australia, where the cabin interior should have been fixed as well. The flight crew who was part of the accident flight had the honour of flying their aircraft to Australia. At Avalon, however, it was damaged again when another Qantas 747 taxied too close to the parked aircraft and embedded its wingtip in the nose of the already stricken 747. That damage was repaired as well, and finally, the 747 was returned to service in early 2009. It remained with Qantas until the end of the year. Later it flew for the Nigerian carrier Mox Air until 2017, when it was eventually stored for good. And that was the story of the strange incident of Qantas 30. If you'd like to see another video about an incident involving a 747, check out my video on Northwest Flight 85 that suffered severe flight control problems. Also, check out my Patreon if you'd like to support this channel. That said, thank you and see you all in the next one.